snow buried everything beneath a sheet of white silence. The elite SEAL team had one mission: rescue 6 trapped soldiers before dawn. Their legendary sniper had just been killed by a single enemy round, leaving the entire unit exposed. Standing among the medics was a quiet young woman no one expected to fight. She calmly picked up the fallen sniper's rifle, whispered that she would finish what he started, and disappeared into the blizzard. Minutes later, impossible shots echoed across the frozen valley. One by one, enemy snipers collapsed. Only then did the SEALs realize the medic beside them had once been America's most feared ghost sniper. The helicopter dropped them at the edge of the tree line just after midnight, the rotor wash kicking up a storm of white that swallowed the world for a few seconds before the aircraft pulled away and left them alone with the wind. 8 men and 1 woman stood at the mouth of a valley that had already claimed 2 rescue attempts that week, both of them ending in silence on the radio and empty seats on the ride home. Commander Jack Morrison counted his people twice before he was satisfied, then looked at the map one more time, even though he had already memorized every ridge and gully on it. 6 soldiers were pinned down in a collapsed listening post 4 miles ahead, surrounded by an enemy force that had turned the high ground into a fortress of ice and stone. The temperature sat at 28 degrees below zero, cold enough to crack skin and slow blood. Cold enough that every man checked his weapon twice because a single jam could mean death. Morrison had led men into worse places, but something about this valley made the hair on his neck stand up before they had even taken their first step. Among them walked a woman named Sarah Whitmore, listed on the roster simply as combat medic, 32 years old, quiet to the point that some of the younger operators had never heard her raise her voice. She carried her pack the way the rest of them carried theirs, evenly, without complaint, her breath fogging beneath a scarf pulled high over her face. Nobody on the team had served with her longer than 8 months, and in that time she had said little about herself beyond the basics required for her file. A few of the men assumed she had simply drawn a hard posting, a woman who patched wounds and carried morphine and stayed out of the way when the bullets started flying. They did not know that her eyes moved differently than theirs, tracking distance and elevation and windline out of habit rather than duty. The way a pianist's fingers move even when there is no piano in the room. Morrison signaled the team forward, his voice pitched low beneath the wind. He glanced back once at Whitmore and told her plainly to stay behind them, to let the shooters handle the shooting and let her handle what came after. She only nodded, the kind of nod that gave nothing away, and fell into position at the rear of the formation where medics were supposed to walk. The column moved through knee-deep snow beneath black pines bent low with ice, every man scanning the tree line, every man trusting the sniper walking point far ahead of them to keep them alive. His name was Daniel Cross, a legend within the community, a man who had never missed a shot that mattered in 11 years of service. He moved 100 yards ahead of the main body, using the terrain the way water uses a riverbed, invisible until he wanted to be seen. Behind him, the rest of the team spread into a loose, staggered line, each man carrying the particular tension of soldiers who understood exactly how thin the margin was between success and disaster in weather like this. Ethan Kowalski walked near the middle of the formation, glancing back more than once at the quiet medic trailing the group, curious about her in the vague way young operators are curious about anyone who does not fit easily into a category. He had heard rumors about her from other units, fragments of stories that never seemed to add up to anything solid, a posting here, a transfer there, nothing that explained why a woman with her composure had ended up carrying bandages instead of leading a squad of her own. He filed the curiosity away, the way soldiers learn to file away everything that is not immediately relevant to staying alive, and turned his attention back to the tree line ahead. The wind picked up as they climbed higher into the valley, carrying with it a fine mist of snow that stung any exposed skin within seconds. Morrison called a brief halt near a frozen creek bed to check positions and confirm the route ahead matched the terrain data from the mission brief, and in that pause Sarah found herself studying the ridgeline above them without quite meaning to. Something about the angle of the slope, the placement of the boulders, the way the tree cover thinned out near the top, triggered a kind of pattern recognition she had spent years trying not to use anymore. She pushed the thought away and returned her attention to checking the straps on her medical pack, telling herself, as she had told herself for years now, that those instincts belonged to a different woman entirely. They had covered perhaps a mile when the valley went wrong all at once. There was no warning, no muzzle flash anyone could place, only the sound of a single shot arriving from somewhere impossibly far away, a crack that rolled across the snow like distant thunder. Daniel Cross dropped where he stood, and by the time the nearest man reached him, it was already too late to do anything but confirm what everyone already knew. The team's eyes only, the shot that had killed him had traveled a distance most snipers would call fiction, more than 2,000 meters through wind and snow and darkness, a shot that required not just skill but a kind of patience that bordered on the supernatural. Morrison called the team down into the snow and felt, for the first time since he had taken command, the cold weight of a mission slipping out of his hands. The team scattered into whatever cover the terrain offered, rocks and fallen trees and shallow drifts that would stop nothing heavier than a stray round. 2 men were already wounded from suppressive fire that had opened up the moment. Cross fell. One shot through the meat of his thigh and another grazed along the ribs, both of them bleeding into the snow while the rest of the unit tried to find an enemy they could not see. Somewhere on the ridgeline above them, hidden shooters had turned the valley into a shooting gallery, and without Cross to answer them, the SEAL team had lost the only voice capable of speaking their language. Morrison barked into his radio for air support and got back nothing but static and a promise that choppers could not fly blind into weather like this. He was a man who had never once panicked in 15 years of combat, and even he felt something close to it now, watching his people bleed while an invisible enemy picked them apart one calculated shot at a time. The minutes that followed felt endless in the way only combat can stretch time, every second measured out in the crack of distant rifles and the low frightened breathing of men pressed flat against frozen ground. Morrison tried 3 separate frequencies before giving up on immediate air support. His voice tight with a frustration he refused to let bleed into panic, because panic was the one thing his team could not afford to see from him now. Around him, soldiers who had trained for years to move as a single coordinated unit found themselves scattered and blind, each man reduced to defending a narrow patch of snow with no way of knowing where the next shot might come from. It was, Morrison would admit much later, the closest he had ever come to losing a team entirely, not through any lack of skill or courage, but through the simple, brutal mathematics of an enemy who could see them in a valley that offered nowhere left to hide. Sarah Whitmore crawled to the nearest wounded man without waiting for orders, her hands already moving before her mind had finished processing the danger, applying pressure and packing the wound with a calm that felt almost out of place amid the chaos around her. She worked with the same steady rhythm she always used, hands sure, voice low and reassuring, telling the young soldier that he would be fine, that the bleeding would stop, that he only needed to breathe. But even as her hands did their work, her eyes lifted again and again toward the ridge above them, scanning the tree line with a focus that had nothing to do with medicine. Something in her posture had shifted, subtle but real, the stillness of a woman listening to a language only she understood. Morrison crawled toward her position, keeping his head low as another round cracked overhead and buried itself in a drift 20 feet away. He asked her status on the wounded man, and she answered without looking away from the mountain, telling him the bleeding was controlled and the soldier would survive if they could get him out. Then she said something that made Morrison stop moving entirely. She told him there were 4 shooters on the ridge, not 2, not 3, but 4, and she gave him their approximate positions as calmly as she might have read off a patient's blood pressure. Morrison stared at her for a long moment, snow collecting on his eyelashes, trying to understand how a combat medic could know something like that from a glance across a battlefield that had swallowed his best sniper without a trace. She did not explain herself in that moment, because there was no time, and because some part of her had hoped she would never have to explain herself again. Years earlier, in a different life that felt now like it belonged to someone else, Sarah Whitmore had been known by another name entirely, a name whispered in briefing rooms and written into classified after-action reports with the kind of reverence usually reserved for myths. They had called her the White Ghost, a sniper whose confirmed kills numbered higher than almost anyone in the modern era, a woman who had once held a record for the longest confirmed shot in her branch of service, a record that stood unbroken for years after she left the field. She had trained in conditions exactly like this one, learning to read wind through falling snow, to calculate drop across distances that seemed to defy physics, to disappear into landscapes so completely that spotters 20 feet away sometimes lost track of her. That life had ended on a mountainside not unlike this one, during a mission that had gone wrong in ways that still visited her in dreams. She had taken the shot she was ordered to take, and it had been the right shot by every measure that mattered, but the extraction that followed had fallen apart, and 2 men she had sworn to protect never came home. It was not her failure by any official accounting. The investigation had cleared her of any wrongdoing entirely, but she had carried the weight of it anyway, the particular grief of a marksman who understands that every choice on a battlefield ripples outward into lives she will never fully account for. She had requested a transfer out of the sniper program within a month, retrained as a combat medic, and told herself that saving lives with her hands would be easier than ending them with a rifle. For years, it had worked. Nobody on her current team knew any of it, because she had never once mentioned the name White Ghost to a single soul since the transfer went through. She remembered the training long before she remembered the killing. The years spent learning to lie motionless in mud and snow for hours at a stretch, learning to slow her own heartbeat until a shot could be released in the narrow gap between pulses, learning to read a flag, or a curl of smoke, or the bend of tall grass, and translate it instantly into numbers that would decide whether a bullet found its target or vanished uselessly into empty air. Her instructors had told her early on that she had a rare kind of patience, the sort that could not be taught, only recognized, and by the end of her first year in the program, she had already outshot instructors who had spent decades behind a rifle. She rose through selection faster than almost anyone in her class, earning a reputation that traveled ahead of her from posting to posting long before most of her fellow soldiers ever learned her name. The mission that ended it all had seemed, in the beginning, like any other. She had been tasked with covering an extraction team moving through hostile terrain, tracking a convoy of enemy vehicles from a position nearly 2 miles distant, waiting for the exact moment when a single shot could disable the lead vehicle without alerting the rest of the column. She had taken that shot precisely as planned, and it had worked exactly as intended. But somewhere in the chaos that followed, radio communication broke down between her position and the ground team, and by the time reinforcements arrived, 2 of the men she was meant to protect had already been overrun. She replayed those minutes constantly in the years that followed, the specific radio call that never quite connected, the specific moment she considered breaking cover to help and chose instead to hold her position exactly as trained. The official investigation cleared her within weeks, finding no fault in her actions or her judgment. But the report could not touch the quiet arithmetic she carried afterward, the certainty that a life given to distance and precision was still a life spent watching people she loved from far enough away that she could not always save them in time. Medicine, she had told herself when she requested the transfer, would put her close enough to matter. Morrison asked her, voice sharp with disbelief, how she could possibly know there were 4 shooters hidden in terrain this brutal, in weather this blinding, from a position this far away. Sarah finally looked at him, something steady and old settling behind her eyes, and told him simply that she would have hidden in exactly those spots herself. It was not bravado, it was the flat, practiced certainty of someone who had spent years thinking like the people trying to kill her, and Morrison, staring at the wounded men around him, and the ridge that had already claimed his sniper, found himself believing her without fully understanding why. The decision that followed was not one anyone gave permission for. Daniel Cross's rifle lay half buried in the snow beside his body, untouched since he fell, a precision weapon with nobody left alive on that ridge to carry it. Sarah crawled to it without a word, brushed the snow from the stock, and checked the action with hands that moved like she had done this 1,000 times before, because she had. One of the younger operators, a man named Ethan Kowalski, who had barely finished his first deployment, grabbed her arm and told her she was a medic, that this was not her job, that they could not afford to lose her too. Sarah looked at him for a moment before answering, her voice quiet but absolute, telling him that today was not about what she was. Today was about getting everyone home. She pulled her arm free, gathered the rifle against her shoulder, and began moving up through the tree line alone, vanishing into the whiteout before Morrison could find the words to stop her. The climb took the better part of an hour, every step placed with deliberate care across ground that could betray her with a single misjudged footfall. She kept low, using deadfall and boulders and the natural folds of the mountain to mask her movement, reading the wind off the way snow curled around exposed rock, the same instincts returning to her body as easily as breathing after years of dormancy. By the time she found a position with a clean line across the ridge, her fingers had gone numb inside her gloves and her heartbeat had slowed to the deliberate rhythm she remembered from a decade of training, the rhythm that let a shooter become still enough to become invisible. She settled into the snow, adjusted for wind and distance and the faint downward angle of the shot, and waited for the moment when everything aligned. The first shot cracked across the valley like the closing of a great door, and far below, an enemy shooter who had been tracking Morrison's position for the last 20 minutes simply stopped moving, his rifle sliding silently down through the snow beside him. Down in the tree line, the SEAL team froze at the sound, uncertain at first whether the shot had come from friend or enemy, until the radio in Morrison's ear crackled with 2 quiet words that told him everything he needed to know. She had found the first shooter exactly where she said he would be. What followed across the next hour became, in the retelling that soldiers would repeat for years afterward, less a firefight than a demonstration. Sarah Whitmore did not take impossible shots or defy the laws of physics the way legends sometimes suggested. She simply did the difficult, patient, exact work that had once made her the most feared name in her field. She calculated the crosswinds sweeping down off the exposed rock face, adjusted for the thinning air at altitude, counted for the way cold temperatures affected bullet drop over extreme distance, and waited, sometimes for minutes at a stretch, for a target to present itself for the fraction of a second that mattered. Each shot that followed was the product of that patience rather than luck. A second shooter falling near a collapsed outcrop, a third caught mid-motion as he repositioned along a ridge he believed was hidden from view. Between shots, she moved with the unhurried economy of someone who had learned long ago that speed was almost always the enemy of accuracy in terrain like this. She would ease herself backward through the snow, careful to disturb as little of the surface as possible, relocate to a position 40 or 50 yards distant, and settle back into stillness until her breathing slowed and her body stopped trembling from the cold enough to guarantee a clean shot. Each relocation cost her precious minutes she knew the men below her were spending pinned down and afraid. But she also knew that a rushed shot at distances like these was worse than no shot at all, a wasted round that would only reveal her position to shooters who had not yet located her. At one point, she lay motionless for nearly 10 full minutes, watching a stretch of exposed rock where she suspected the second shooter had taken position, resisting every instinct that urged her to fire at the first flicker of movement. When he finally shifted his weight to relieve the strain of holding a position too long, the movement lasted less than a second, and it was enough. The shot traveled clean and true across the gap between them, and the shape on the rock went still in a way that told her everything she needed to know without needing to see the result up close. She allowed herself no satisfaction in the moment, only the same quiet calculation that carried her immediately toward locating the next threat, because satisfaction was a luxury that belonged to a battlefield already won, and this one was still very much undecided. Below in the trees, the SEAL team watched the enemy's confidence collapse in real time. Men who had been firing with calm, coordinated precision only an hour earlier began moving erratically, taking cover that offered no real protection, abandoning positions that had taken hours to establish. Morrison keyed his radio and asked for a status update, and the 2 words that came back were simple and absolute. 3 down. Ethan Kowalski, still shaken by what he had witnessed, muttered to the man beside him that whoever she really was, she was not a medic. Not really. Not in any sense that mattered on a battlefield like this one. The enemy, for their part, understood soon enough that they were no longer dealing with a lucky rifleman picking off exposed men from cover. Word passed among their remaining shooters, urgent and afraid, that a new sniper had entered the valley, one whose shots carried a precision that did not belong to an amateur. The hunters became the hunted in the span of a single radio transmission, and the men who had spent the morning stalking a SEAL team now found themselves searching the mountainside for a shooter they could not locate, a shape in the snow that seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah felt the shift immediately, the subtle change in enemy fire patterns that told her they had stopped hunting the men in the valley and started hunting her instead. She moved without hesitation, abandoning her position seconds before a burst of return fire tore through the snow where she had been lying, rolling behind a granite outcrop and reassessing with the same clinical calm that had carried her through a dozen missions in a different lifetime. 3 shooters remained that she could account for, skilled men who had clearly trained together, coordinating their movements in a way that told her this was not her first encounter with professionals of this caliber. She used the terrain the way she always had, snow for concealment, shadow for cover, the uneven ground itself as a kind of armor, shifting position after every shot so that no return fire ever found the same spot twice. The duel that followed tested every instinct she had ever built. She traded positions along nearly half a mile of ridge, staying low, staying patient, letting the storm itself become part of her camouflage as visibility dropped to almost nothing. At one point, a round meant for her skull instead tore across her shoulder, opening a shallow but vicious wound that sent blood spreading dark and quick against the white snow beneath her. The pain arrived a half-second later, sharp and blinding, and for a moment, her vision narrowed to a tunnel of white noise and heartbeat. She pressed her good hand against the wound just long enough to slow the bleeding, tied a strip of cloth around it with her teeth and her free hand, and settled back behind her rifle without a sound of complaint, because stopping now meant more than her own life on the line. She fired again with her wounded arm trembling beneath the weight of the rifle, forcing her breathing into the same measured rhythm that had carried her through every difficult shot of her career, and the fourth shooter fell silent against the rock where he had taken position. Down in the trees, Morrison heard the exchange of fire slow and then stop almost entirely, an eerie quiet settling over the valley that felt more unnerving than the gunfire itself had been. With most of the immediate threat cleared from the ridge, Sarah turned her attention to the larger battle unfolding around the collapsed listening post, where the 6 trapped soldiers still waited for rescue. The enemy had reinforced their position with a machine gun nest that had pinned the SEAL team's advance for the better part of an hour, along with a small stockpile of ammunition, stored in a half-buried bunker that had clearly been built to outlast a siege. Sarah worked methodically from her position on the ridge, disabling the machine gun crew with 2 shots placed seconds apart, then turning her attention to the enemy commander she identified through brief, careful observation of who the remaining soldiers deferred to. When she finally put a round through the stockpile itself, the resulting explosion lit up the valley floor in a burst of orange that briefly turned the storm to daylight, sending the last of the disorganized enemy soldiers scattering for cover that no longer existed. Morrison used the chaos to push his team forward at last, reaching the collapsed listening post and finding all 6 trapped soldiers alive, cold and exhausted but alive, huddled together in a shelter that had nearly become their grave. The relief among the men was immediate and physical, shoulders dropping, breath escaping in long clouds of vapor, but the mission was not yet finished. The valley remained too hot for extraction, enemy reinforcements audible in the distance even through the storm, and the helicopter assigned to pull them out radioed that it could not risk a landing until the airspace was confirmed clear. It was in that tense, uncertain window that the enemy's final answer arrived. A single shot rang out from a position much farther away than any of the previous shooters had used, so precise and so distant that even Sarah, lying wounded in the snow, understood immediately what it meant. Somewhere on the mountain, the enemy's own legend had finally entered the fight, a shooter whose reputation she recognized from briefings years earlier, a man rumored to hold a confirmed record for distance that rivaled her own. The shot he had just taken missed her by inches, close enough that she felt the disturbance of air against her cheek, close enough to tell her that whoever he was, he already knew exactly where to look. The duel that followed unfolded across nearly 3,000 a storm-battered mountainside, a distance so extreme that neither shooter could see the other, except as a shape barely distinguishable from rock and snow. Both understood that a single mistake, a single moment of impatience, would end everything. The wind shifted constantly, gusting hard enough at times to bend the falling snow sideways, and both snipers waded through it, adjusting and readjusting, refusing to fire until the conditions aligned exactly as they needed to. Down below, the SEAL team held their position in absolute silence, aware that somewhere above them a battle was being fought in a language none of them could read, one built entirely of patience, mathematics, and nerve. Sarah shifted her position twice more in the opening minutes, each move small and deliberate, never more than a few feet at a time, always careful to keep fresh snow undisturbed around her final resting spot. She knew from long experience that a shooter of this caliber would be watching not for a person but for a pattern. The faint disruption of an otherwise undisturbed landscape, the single shadow that fell wrong against a slope of unbroken white. She controlled her breathing the way she had been taught a lifetime ago, 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 4 counts out, letting the rhythm anchor her against the pain still radiating from her injured shoulder. Somewhere across the valley, she knew, the other shooter was doing precisely the same thing, and the knowledge of that shared discipline was almost a kind of respect, one professional recognizing another even as they hunted each other beneath a darkening sky. Twice she caught the faintest suggestion of movement near a distant outcrop, a texture in the snow that seemed, for half a second, out of place, and both times she resisted the urge to fire, understanding that a premature shot at this range would do nothing but reveal her own position for nothing. Patience, she reminded herself, silently, the way her old instructors used to say it aloud during training exercises that stretched on for entire days without a single shot fired. The battlefield rewards the shooter who can outlast their own fear, not the one who reacts first. She thought briefly of the 2 men she had lost years earlier, of how differently that day might have ended if patience alone could have saved them. and pushed the thought away before it could loosen the steadiness in her hands. The cold had begun working against her in ways that worried her more than the enemy did. Her injured shoulder had stiffened considerably in the deepening freeze, and she could feel her fingers growing clumsy despite her gloves, small warning signs that her body was reaching the outer edge of what it could endure in weather like this. She allowed herself exactly one slow, controlled movement to flex her hand back to life, timing it carefully between gusts of wind, strong enough to mask any sound or motion, and then settled back into position, rifle steady against her good shoulder, eye fixed on the narrow window of terrain where she expected the shot to eventually come from. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Sarah's shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, her fingers stiff with cold and blood loss, her breathing slowed by sheer discipline into something barely perceptible. She thought, in the strange clarity that extreme danger sometimes brings, of the two men she had lost years earlier, of the reason she had walked away from this exact kind of moment, and she understood with total certainty that she was not doing this to reclaim some old name or old glory. She was doing it because 6 men beneath her needed a helicopter to land, and one more shot stood between them and going home. Somewhere in that long stretch of waiting, she found herself thinking not of the enemy shooter across the valley but of the ordinary moments that had filled the years since she left the sniper program behind. The quiet satisfaction of closing a wound cleanly, of watching a frightened young soldier calm down under her steady hands, of feeling useful in a way that had nothing to do with distance or trajectory. She had told herself for years that those small, close moments mattered more than any record she had once held. And lying in the snow now with her old life reawakened around her, she found she still believed it completely. The rifle in her hands was a tool she had once mastered and then set aside, not a piece of her identity she needed to reclaim, and that distinction, she realized, was exactly what would let her make the shot when it came without hesitation or doubt clouding her aim. She became aware, distantly, of the sounds below her in the valley, faint through the wind, the murmur of Morrison's team shifting position, a low cough quickly stifled, the particular hush of men trying to make themselves as small and silent as possible, while a battle they could not see played out somewhere above them. She thought of Ethan Kowalski's hand on her arm hours earlier, of his insistence that this was not her job, and allowed herself the smallest private acknowledgement that he had been both entirely wrong and entirely right at once. It was not her job. It had simply become, in the space of one impossible night, the only job that mattered. The wind died for less than 2 seconds, a rare, perfect stillness in a storm that had shown no mercy all night. Both shooters recognized the window at the same instant. A single shot cracked across the valley, swallowed almost immediately by the return of the wind, and then silence fell so complete that even the storm seemed to hold its breath. Snow kicked up in a fine spray somewhere on the distant ridge, and for a long, unbearable moment, nobody in the valley below knew who was still alive. Morrison stared up into the whiteout, his radio silent, his heart hammering in a way it had not since his very first deployment. He called Sarah's position twice and got nothing back but static, and for a terrible stretch of seconds, he allowed himself to imagine explaining to command how he had lost both his sniper and the medic who had replaced him in the same impossible mission. Then the radio crackled to life, her voice steady despite the pain audible beneath it, delivering 2 words that ended the longest silence of the night. Target eliminated. The SEAL team erupted into something between relief and disbelief, men who rarely allowed themselves emotion on a mission letting out sounds somewhere between a cheer and a prayer. Minutes later, with the valley finally quiet and the storm easing just enough to open a narrow window of visibility, the helicopter descended through the clearing skies and touched down at the edge of the tree line. Sarah came down from the ridge on her own power, refusing help even as blood soaked through the makeshift bandage on her shoulder, her steps slow but deliberate across the snow. Morrison met her at the bottom, studying her with an expression that mixed awe and something close to disbelief. And it was only then, as command relayed information over a secure channel back at base, that he learned who exactly had been walking beside his team for the past 8 months. The name attached to her old service record, buried deep in classified files that few people ever had reason to access, was the same name that had once been spoken with reverence in briefing rooms across an entire generation of special operations. The White Ghost, a legend most of the younger operators had assumed was exaggerated campfire mythology, had been carrying their morphine and bandages the entire time. Headquarters requested a private debrief with her the moment the team returned to base, an unusual request that told everyone involved just how significant her actions that night had truly been. She sat through hours of questions afterward, calm and precise in her answers the way she had always been, describing distances and wind conditions and target sequencing with the same clinical detachment she once used to describe a patient's vitals. When the formal proceedings finally ended, a senior officer offered her something few operators ever received twice in one career: a full reinstatement into the sniper program with immediate promotion and a permanent posting to lead training for the next generation of shooters. Sarah considered the offer for exactly as long as politeness required before declining it. She told the officer, quietly but without hesitation, that saving lives was why she had stayed in the field at all these past years. Taking a shot, she explained, had only ever been necessary because someone needed to come home, and she had no interest in returning to a life built around the rifle rather than the men and women it was meant to protect. The officer did not push further, recognizing in her answer the same steadiness that had carried her through the worst night of the mission. Back at the forward base, days later, the 6 rescued soldiers stood alongside the SEAL team as Sarah prepared to rotate out for medical leave, her shoulder wrapped and healing beneath her jacket. Morrison called the group to attention, an unusual formality for a team accustomed to informal respect rather than ceremony, and told her plainly, in front of everyone, that she had not simply saved the mission that night. She had saved every single one of them, and no medal or classified file would ever fully capture what that meant to the men standing in the snow around her. Ethan Kowalski, the young operator who had once grabbed her arm and told her this was not her job, stepped forward and offered a quiet, sincere thank you that needed no further explanation. Sarah accepted their gratitude the way she accepted most things, with a small nod and few words, uncomfortable with the weight of being called a hero by men who had fought just as hard as she had that night. Morrison studied her for a long moment before adding one more thing, telling her quietly that whatever name the classified files used, the team would only ever know her by the one she had chosen for herself, the quiet medic who had stayed behind them exactly as ordered, right up until the moment staying behind them stopped being enough. Sarah allowed herself the smallest suggestion of a smile at that, the first anyone on the team had seen from her since the mission began, and told him that suited her fine. The days that followed at the forward base passed in the particular quiet that settles over any unit after a mission that nearly broke it. The 6 rescued soldiers were flown out first, each of them pausing before boarding to shake her hand or offer a word of thanks that she accepted with the same understated grace she brought to everything else. Ethan Kowalski found her alone near the equipment tents on her final morning, still awkward in the way young soldiers often are when trying to express something larger than they have words for, and admitted that he had misjudged her completely, that he owed her an apology for ever doubting she belonged on that mountain. Sarah told him there was nothing to apologize for, that most people misjudged quiet more often than they misjudged noise, and that the mistake had cost him nothing in the end. He left the exchange looking, for the first time since she had known him, like a soldier who understood exactly what kind of unit he had been lucky enough to serve in. When the moment finally passed and the team dispersed to prepare for the transport home, she shouldered her medical pack one last time and walked toward the waiting vehicle alone, her boots leaving a quiet line of prints across snow that had already begun falling again to cover them. She never spoke of that night publicly, and within the tightly sealed world of classified operations, the details remained locked away from anyone without the clearance to read them. But among the men who had stood in that valley, in the quiet conversations shared over the years that followed, a new chapter attached itself to an old legend, one about a ghost who had traded a rifle for a medic's bag and found, in the end, that both were simply different ways of bringing people home. The snow kept falling long after she was gone, filling in her footprints one flake at a time, until there was nothing left to mark where she had walked except the memory carried by every soldier whose life she had saved that night. A memory that would outlast the storm, outlast the mission, and outlast whatever name the record books chose to remember her by.